Coach Dave Delta offers you a large range of setups to use in Le Mans Ultimate. They may not always suit your driver preferences. For example, the safe and balanced setups are made to be as user-friendly as possible and as stable, while not always having as much front-end bite. But what happens if that's what you're looking for? What happens if you're looking for more front-end bite and need to adapt the setup to suit your preferences? What sort of questions do you need to ask yourself before making certain adjustments to the setup? Well, today, that's what I'm going to be talking about. My name's Whitehead, and you are watching the Coach David Le Mans Ultimate YouTube channel. So first things first, we are going to try the Lexus RCF at Silverstone, because I feel like it's a pretty nuanced car, with a lot of different things you can adapt, a lot of different things you need to compromise for, especially at Silverstone, which again is a very nuanced circuit in itself. You know, it's a mix of high speed, a mix of low speed, and lots of different questions that need answering when making adaptations to a setup. We're going to be starting on the CDA QB01 today. So that's going to be one of the balanced qualifying setups for this car. So let's see how it feels. Now, I've done a couple of laps already, just to try and get a feel for the car and a feel for the track. And in general, I've found already a couple of things that I don't fully suit, or that don't suit me. The car feels a little bit understeery into low speed corners, a little bit understeery on throttle, but at the same time feels a little bit sensitive going into high speed braking zones. So here's one coming up, going to Stowe. Obviously, pretty much the highest speed, in fact I think it is the highest speed pace on the track, going to 252 kph pretty much. And it wasn't really apparent there, but when you're on a full push lap, the car does move around a little bit on the trading phase. So there's something I'd like to change a little bit if possible. And then obviously the understeer on throttle, you'll see through here. So you can see we got a little bit of oversteer just because of the traction issues. But as soon as the traction issues at low speeds are gone, the car does understeer a bit. So obviously knowing the Lexus quite well, and obviously it being front engined in LMU, the front engined cars in general do struggle a bit for low speed traction. So that is something that you can mitigate, but it's not really something you want to work the setup around, because it's always going to happen. It's one of those things that you can't really fix, unfortunately. And obviously, being LMU, the GT3s handle quite uniquely. The front end and rear end feel quite disconnected at times, which means that you have to work this setup a little bit differently to what you would on, say, ACC or iRacing. And I think that catches a lot of people out, because they try and get a positive front end by removing the rear, which, in certain other sims works very well. But in LMU, it just ends up getting a car that doesn't have too much more front, but is very, very snappy in response. Is very, very snappy on the rear, and often unpredictable. And obviously with the balance setups made by CDA, and the safe setups, they're made to be, less snappy. And obviously you can see this setup is not snappy at all. So that's a very good thing. It's a very nice handling characteristic. Especially at Silverstone, where it is a very difficult track with a lot of different chicanes and direction changes and whatnot. You do want a car that is pretty stuck to the road, and that is what this setup feels like. But of course, I'd like a bit more front end. So there are obviously still some questions to ask before we make any changes to the setup. But at least, I'm starting to get a feel for what the setup is doing. And I think that is always very important, is that, it's very easy to get initial feelings for a setup. If you do 1 or 2 laps out the box and you feel something with the setup, it's very easy to just go off of that and just go, oh yeah, I'll change, this, I'll change this. And then the setup feels awful because you've just gone based purely off of instinct and off of initial impressions. And while yes, you're always going to feel some of the car's handling characteristics quite accurately on the initial testing, basing your entire setup on those impressions initially is a slippery slope. So I always recommend that you do drive, at least a couple of runs on the setup to get as much of a picture, as you can. Because again, I'm feeling stuff now on this, I think, this 3rd run that I've done this setup. I'm feeling things now that I didn't feel the first time. Like that, for example, that little oversteer kick we got under braking at the very late stage. Partially that was my input being different, but it is something I still felt. which could hint at the brake bias being a bit too far backwards, for example. You know, so again, I didn't feel that on the first 2 runs, so I probably wouldn't have changed the brake bias, but now I'm getting the sense that, maybe that could be something I change, you know, as opposed to changing something else. So I think it's always very important to get a big, clear picture of what the setup is doing before jumping in and just making changes, you know, rash changes and rash decisions. Because you can end up just going around in circles, you know, change one thing, change it back, because you're just rushing into decisions. And ironically, that is something I used to do quite a lot. You know, I'd start on a setup, I'd think, oh, this needs changed, or this needs changed. Or I'd change it and then just go back to the original setup, because, you know, I went off of instinct and off of like 1 or 2 outlaps of running. Whereas you should be doing, you know, 3 or 4 laps and then doing multiple runs of that to really get an idea of what the car is doing. Because, again, the car's not going to handle the same on lap 1 or 2 as it is on lap 3 or 4. You know, the tyres might not be fit at temperature, or, you know, the tyre might wear down a little bit and the car might handle a bit differently. So it's always important to not just jump in. You see we're on a pretty decent lap now. Bear in mind, again, we're not pushing for world records. But yeah, we can definitely feel the car is a little bit on the understeer side at high speed. But at low speed, it feels pretty decent. Little bit of understeer in the second phase of that hairpin left. That was a pretty awful final sector, but we've still improved. Let's see if we can go for 1 more lap. See if we can maybe push the envelope a little bit more and see what this car really does. And you're starting to really throw the car around. Finally got through Sector 1 decently enough without invalidating. The steer on throttle there. Gear is definitely better out of there. Reserve that a bit. Okay, that is a lap though. 59.0, I think. Okay, that's decent enough. Not too bad. Okay. Well, that's now RTG. And let's go over that checklist that I made to see what we need to change about the setup next. Okay, so here we have a little checklist that I've made, just as our initial thoughts to note down for the setup and how it feels. So, first and foremost, how is the initial balance? Does the car have any severe outlying characteristics that need changing? So, during my laps, I mentioned that the car had a little bit of understeer on throttle. So that's the first thing I want to mention, because it's the first thing that came to my mind. It's always helpful to write this down, even though I don't always do this. It is also important to sometimes get your thoughts out on paper or thoughts out on a document to figure out what you actually want to change and make sure that you are as logical and, you know, as thorough as possible to make sure you don't do the wrong things. So on throttle understeer, particularly out of the club section. So the club section is just going onto the F1 main straight. Second thing I noticed was high speed understeer. So particularly into Abbey and also into Maggots, Beckets and Chapel. So high speed understeer, particularly Abbey and Copse. I think that's actually 1p. That is 1p. And then the other thing I noticed was that the car was a little bit nervous under braking. So going to the high speed, braking zones, for example, at the end of the Hanger Straight going into Stowe, the car was a little bit nervous under braking. So that is something I also want to mention. So a little nervous under braking from high speeds, Stowe and Brooklands. Now, was there anything else that I could think of that I want changing? Not really. There's a little bit of low speed understeer. But again, we can probably group that with this, and we can probably hit 2 birds with 1 stone, given that it's probably a more aero-related thing that we can change. Okay, so those are the 3 things we've got so far. I'll highlight those in red so far, just as things we haven't changed yet. Now, second question. Once we've done the subjective stuff, does the setup lack anything objective? So, is it a bit slow down the straights? Does it wear the front tyres or rear tyres more than it should? And do you want to change that? So, to answer that question, we're going to go into LMU once again, and we're going to watch a replay of what we were doing. So, actually, first and foremost, before we do that, tyre management percentages. Now, as you can see, the fronts are wearing more than the rears. That's not uncommon for Silverstone. But after only a quali run of, was it 2 or 3 laps, maybe 4 laps, a 2% difference between your front and the rears is a lot, which hints that the car is understeering and scrubbing the fronts. So that's something very important that we've just established. So let's look at the replay really quickly. There's only really one place I want to look at, based on top speed, which is obviously going into Stowe. So if we go, we can look here on the bottom right. So we brake at 252 kph. Now, you could argue that that's a little bit slow down the straight. For example, the Corvette, I believe, was 255 when I drove the laps here. I think the Ford was 254.6 or 255, something like that. So, again, a couple of cars, 255. So, already, we're lacking a little bit in the top end. So, we can write that down. And if I just get the thing back up. So, first and foremost, we'll just do wearing fronts severely and a little slow down the Hanger Straight. Now, obviously, there's a caveat. It could be down to us being a little bit slow out of Chapel, but it's still worth mentioning because, again, I think the setup is quite high wing, and we'll look over that in just a second. So, 252 kph versus 255. And then, obviously, that comes on to our final question of how big do the changes need to be? So, obviously, do we need to completely rework the setup? No. The balance was decent. It just needs a little bit more pointy front end and a little bit more, probably a little bit less wing. So, we'll just say general balance and mechanical setup is good, just requires aero adjustments and small tweaks. Okay, so first things first, let's try and tackle this, shall we? So on throttle understeer, particularly out of club. Now usually when there's throttle understeer or off throttle understeer, it's as a result of this, the diff preload. Usually if you're getting oversteer off throttle and understeer on throttle, it means that your preload is too low. And as you can see, we are set at 20 Newton meters. So that confirms our suspicion that the diff is too low. So what we need to do is raise that value. So I'm going to go to around 70, 75. It's not hugely sensitive in the Lexus, but in some cars like the Ford, for example, it is extremely sensitive. So that will be something you need to feel out. It's not a huge change. It's one of the more minor changes, but it can make a massive difference to your car. So now we can just go back into this. We can highlight that as green, or we can actually highlight that as yellow, because that's something we've made an adjustment to. We need to confirm whether it works. Now, what you could do, if you're being really thorough, is you could go out and test that individually. But I actually know that's going to work, having looked at one of my other setups and seen that the differential is a bit higher. So what I'm actually going to do is jump straight into these two changes. So a little nervous under braking. The differential will also help that. Obviously, you're off throttle into those corners, and the diff will be working when you're turning in. So that might have solved that nervousness. So we will put that as a yellow as well. But alongside that, we will also move the brake bias slightly forward. So you can see, yes, we are rearwards on the brake bias. We're at 48.8. So let's just set that to 50.0. Just one or so percent forward, and just see if that makes the difference. Now, let's go back to high speed understeer and a little slow down the straight. So those are the two that we kind of want to look at, because they're both high speed, and we can potentially hit two birds with one stone here. So if we look at, let me just close this window again. Let's look at the aero, shall we? So suspension, we've already got quite a lot of rear ride height there. Could probably add some more, but I don't want to touch that just yet. The rake looks fine, and it looks quite aggressive. Now let's have a look at the mechanical, let's have a look at the rear wing. 11, so you can see we go up to 13, so we are over middle wing. We are quite high on the rear wing, and having seen some other setups and driven this car before, we know we can run as low as 7 and it still be viable. But I'm not going to do that just yet. We're going to try 9 on the rear wing. And that's all we're going to change for now. You see, we've changed the preload, so we should have a little less rotation off throttle and a little more on throttle. We should be a little bit quicker down the straights, and we should have a little bit more rotation at high speed corners. And we should also be a bit more stable under braking because of the brake bias. So let's see if that fixes our issue. Okay, let's give this setup a go. So again, I'll need to be wary that I can't attack Maggots, Beckets and Chapel quite as much as I did before, because we're not going to have as much rear downforce. But in theory, we should be able to attack the corners like Stowe a little bit more. So let's see. And we should also be able to use the throttle a little bit for extra rotation on exits, which will definitely help our cause. So you can see already the car is a lot more responsive. It's not snappy at all. We've still kept the mechanical grip the same. The car should handle more or less the same, with just a little bit lighter rear. You can see we're already 253 there, on and out lap, so we are definitely faster down the straight. Still quite understeery at low speed. But you can see on throttle, we're actually sliding under throttle, so we've got a lot more rotation now, which is good. Perhaps a bit too much, but we've at least solved part of that issue. Now high speed. See, we're still getting a bit of that understeer, so we've still kept that balance that we had before, but the car is slightly more aggressive now. You can see in the braking, we're actually tramlining a little bit, so we're going a little bit too deep, which might indicate that the brake bias is a little too far forwards now. So we'll move it to 49.5. You do this on the fly in the car. So let's see if this helps. And in fairness, we might not even have needed to move the brake bias because the differential preload might actually have solved, you know, most of the issue that we had with the off-throttle instability and braking. You can see already much better rotation on the exit of Cops. A little bit snappy out of there. But the car definitely does feel better. Still not completely perfect. I still feel like I've potentially limited the rear a bit too much. I'm still not getting quite enough bite at low speeds. But the on-throttle rotation is definitely better. And I think the biggest takeaway and the biggest thing to remember when making setups is you're not always going to get it right. No, you're going to make setups changes that don't work. And that is all part of the learning process. You know, as you can see, I think the setup changes have worked in a sense. You know, we definitely quicker down the straight, we have better on-throttle rotation, we have better rotation in general. But I have also added some artifacts that I don't particularly like. Which is, again, something that you will need to adjust and try to figure out what actually works for you. You can see much more stable, much easier to roll through that corner now with the higher diff. Yeah, look how much quicker we were in the last couple of corners now. This car was a little bit easier to rotate. We're into the 58s now. Still a little understeery on the throttle. But again, still up a little bit on our time. There we go. Now that we're actually used how the car reacts, look at that delta now. So again, I'm not trying to drive the car like the previous setup. I'm having a little bit more respect for the car, so you know, not trying to force the rotation in like we were before. Kind of letting the car do its thing and then using the throttle to get the final part of rotation in the corner. A little bit of curb usage there wasn't ideal. It's a bit understeery there. Wasn't ideal, Luke. Yeah. Oh, what was that, Luke? But this setup's kind of fallen apart, unfortunately. But again, you guys can see we've only changed 3 things on the setup, and we've already, you know, 3/10 up or so on our lap. And again, we've maintained the balance of the car. You know, the car isn't snapping on me; it's still stable. You know, yeah, there's definitely a bit of a loose rear end, but the front is a lot more responsive. Still a little bit on the understeery side for sure. But again, this is all stuff we can fix. And already we've gained a lot of lap time. It's coming on for nearly 2 tenths we've gained already. And have another 2 tenths just in the lap being better anyway. Okay, we're still getting on throttle oversteer. Understeer, sorry. And we are still getting that washing front. And we're still getting that front tyre wear. Temps do seem lower than they were before, though. Okay, so we've seen those changes have worked, at least somewhat. But let's go into that checklist once again and figure out what other questions need answering and what other changes need to be made to further refine this setup. So, we are back in the checklist once again. You can see we've just copy and pasted the same questions again. I will cut this out because we don't really need that just yet. Okay, so initial balance. Let's go over that again. So the rear feels more loose. but still not snappy. So the rear side of the car feels nice. The lower rear wing definitely helped us a bit through the high-speed stuff. Not so much through Abbey, but especially through Stowe, Maggots, Beckett's and Chapel. The car was a lot more on the edge, but still manageable and still stable for me to use. However, we still had that understeer through Abbey. We still had that understeer particularly into Brooklands, and we still had that understeer through Club. So still low speed understeer and Abbey understeer. And then finally, is there anything else that we can think of that I needed to change? Not really. The wing felt nice, we were faster down the straight, and the tyre wear on the front was less severe than it was before. So we have improved the setup, but it still needs a little bit more, I think. Alright, does the setup lack any objective characteristics? So, again, we've established it was quicker down the straights. Could still use a bit more down the straight, but for now I just want to keep the wing as it is. And the front, it still wears a little bit more. So the fronts are better than before, but still wear a little excessively. And then finally, how big do the changes need to be? So now we've established we only need small tweaks here. We haven't changed a lot anyway, but the car is pretty close to where I want it to be. Small tweaks to the front only, as rear balance and lack of snappy behavior is good. Okay, so let's get into what sort of changes we can make. Okay, so let's have a look at this setup, shall we? So let's do a bit of a deeper dive into how this setup looks and what sort of things we can change. So diff preload, we established we could probably up this a little bit more. We've still got quite a bit of understeer on throttle, but for now I'm going to leave that as it is because I'm going to look at the other stuff we've got to look at in the setup. So camber, you wouldn't really touch too much in this car at least. Brake bias, we established 49.5 was the sweet spot. Brake power doesn't need to change. Maybe could lower it a little bit to make the car a bit nicer under braking, but it's not needed, so we don't need to look at that. Now, suspension. So this is what I wanted to kind of look at because I feel like this is where I want to change the car next. So, I just wanted to quickly go over the GT3 setups and what sort of sliders do certain different things. So the preload affects purely your on-throttle and off-throttle characteristics of the car. So a lower preload, for example 0 Newton meters or 10 Newton meters, will have more off-throttle rotation, which means you'll generally get more rotation on entry and when you're coasting. Whereas you get less on-throttle rotation when you apply the throttle, the car will generally understeer more than on entry. But if you run a higher preload, so for example 100 Newton meters or 150 Newton meters, you'll get less off-throttle rotation, so the car will be more benign on entry, but you'll get more on-throttle rotation, so when you hit the throttle, the car will rotate more than on entry. So that's why in the Lexus, for example, we raised the preload more to get more on-throttle rotation through cops. The Packer limits the amount of suspension travel the car has. Higher value equals less total travel. So for example, if you're running 0 Packer, the car will pitch to its maximum ability and will have no limit to the suspension travel, other than bottoming essentially or hitting the end of the suspension. But if you run 1.0 centimeters, for example, the car will have 1.0 centimeters less travel less travel possible. So if the car, for example, is under braking and the front is going as low as 25 millimeters on the ground, if you have 1 centimeter less Packer, it will then be 35 millimeters that the front will bottom out at, or the front will pitch. That will be the maximum pitch level, I guess. Dampers, the left arrow means softer, the right arrow means stiffer. So essentially, if you're running a Lexus, for example, we'll go into that menu really quick. If we run higher damper, you can see it's hard, so it's stiffer. But if you go to the left, it's softer. But sometimes the numbers are inverted, so sometimes the stiffer value will be a lower number. So sometimes in the Aston, I think, for example, if you go to the end value, this will be P1, and then the end value will be P11 or whatever. So sometimes the numbers are inverted, so just easy way to remember, the right arrow means stiffer, the left arrow means softer. This is the same for springs. The slow rebound dictates how aggressively the car returns after pitching under load. So, for example, the front slow rebound dictates how aggressively the front returns to normal when releasing the brake or adding throttle. So when the front comes off the ground, after pitching aggressively under braking, if it's a soft rebound, the front will return very quickly, which means you'll generally get snap understeer after releasing the brake. So if you need a little bit more front during that trailing period, when you're trailing off the brake and you need a bit more front, you would stiffen the slow rebound and move it to the right-hand side. Whereas on the rear, if you're getting a lot of oversteer under braking and you feel like the rear is pitching up too quickly, then you'd stiffen that rear slow rebound, because that basically dictates how aggressive the rear pitches upwards while not accelerating and when coasting, for example. So it's not just when you're braking, it's when you're coasting as well. The fast dampers mostly impact how the car rides the curbs and bumps. So if a car is bouncing when it hits the curb and bumps and it's like riding too rough when you hit the curb, then you need to soften the fast bump. But if the car is bouncing when you come off that curb, so for example in ACC quite a lot the cars would bounce, after you come off the curb, and in LMU that is also the case sometimes, in which case you'll need to stiffen the fast rebound. And finally, the springs. The left arrow means softer, the right arrow means stiffer. So essentially, if your car feels like it's pitching too much, you'll want to stiffen that spring and move it to the right-hand side. What I'm feeling like is the car almost doesn't pitch enough on the front end. So when we're braking and turning, the front is still boating wide and we're not really leaning on the tyres enough. And that would indicate as well by the tyre wear being very high on the front, because we're scrubbing the fronts. The tyres are absorbing all the force, rather than the suspension doing that as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lower the front spring rate by a click, and I'm going to remove the front packers. This might be too excessive, but I want to give it a try anyway. What I always say is if you go too far, it's always better just to backstep a little bit and figure out where you're at. Otherwise you're never going to find the limits. But that is what I'm going to try so far. We're going to check the dampers, see if there's anything worth looking at there. Okay, so we got the slow bump's very soft, so we don't need to change that. I think maybe you'd stiffen it a little bit to counteract the softer springs, but for now we're not going to touch it. Slow rebound, don't need to change that. Could maybe up it a little bit to make the car a little bit less pitchy on the front, so make the front sort of raise on throttle a little bit less. But again, I don't think we need to do that. Fast bump and rebound, the car feels fine over curbs. I don't think we need to adjust those, and there's no real bumps at Silverstone either, other than the curbs. So again, we don't need to touch the fast dampers for this car, on the front or the rear. Rear slow bump, we could maybe stiffen that a little bit. In fact, I'm going to leave it as it is for now. I'm just going to do one change at a time. Slow rebound feels fine. The car feels fine on entry. The rear is not going up too high under braking, so that's fine. We're not going to touch those. So dampers look fine. Chassis and aero. Now, the low speed stuff, so going to club, we didn't have enough front bite in my opinion. So how I'm going to change that is I'm going to change the toe. So we've currently got a bit of toe in, which means that the wheels are pointed that way. So they're pointed sort of in towards each other ever so slightly. Now, the way you get a little bit more bite is by turning that to negative, so the wheels point slightly away from each other, so that when you turn, the inside tyres they're a bit more aggressive essentially when you're turning it. So we are going to invert it. We're going to go to minus 0.06 degrees. That should hopefully give us a bit more bite at low speed, and hopefully make the front scrub a little less at high speed, in theory. And that's all we're going to change so far. We're going to change these two things, and then we're going to see if we're finally there with the setup. Okay, final time. We have our new boots on, otherwise known as new tyres, new rubber. Let's go out now and see if our changes and our checklist things have worked to the desired effect. So again, I'm not so worried about lap time. If we don't beat that 58.8, I'm not too worried. I'm more worried about how the car feels. But again, it should be a relatively subtle shift. The front should feel a little bit more responsive and a little bit more pitch sensitive. And the front tyres should bite a little bit more aggressively at low speed. So the front still feels relatively stable under braking. You can see we are getting that rotation though. You see how aggressive the front was there in the midpoint of the corner. Alright, moment of truth. Does the front bite more than it did before? The answer is a definitive yes. Still getting a little bit of mid-corner boatiness, which again, front engined, it's kind of a thing with this car. But you can see the car definitely does bite a little bit better in that section. That is the same through Abbey as well. Look how much narrower we were able to keep it through the right there. Again, still a little bit of exit understeer. And that is okay. A little bit of boatiness into there as well, but I think that was partially my own mistake. But again, on the initial, the setup does feel slightly better than it did before. But let's see if that is actually the case when we actually go to push for a lap. Alright, first lap on this new setup. Okay, I think I was right about the slow bump being a little bit too soft on the front. So I can definitely feel that under braking the front does dive a bit too aggressively. But again, that's okay. We're more thinking about the actual core cornering characteristics of the car first. Because if those are good, then we can start thinking about the smaller changes like dampers and whatnot. So a little bit of oversteer there. Okay, well that feels a lot better. Feels a lot better in the second half of the lap than the other setup. That is for sure. There we go. Better sector 1 now. Bad stove from me there. Definitely think that slow bump is a bit too soft on the front, unfortunately. But I still want to complete this up anyway. You can actually see under braking, the car does tramline quite a bit. You know, the front seems to the front seems to pitch too much, and we just go straight under braking, which is because the damper is too soft on the front. But even with that, the setup does definitely drive better than it did before. I think we've definitely improved the setup for my preferences. And there we go. Still not a great lap, but significantly faster than we had before. Oh, not quite a 6. Could have been the funny number. But it's a 7-0 so far. And again, tyre temps are even lower than they were before. And the right side tyres have worn exactly the same as the rears. The left side tyre on the front is still wearing a little bit more. But again, you can see decidedly the wear is a lot more even. So, final pass of the setup. Let's have a look and answer those questions for one last time. Okay, and for the final time, let's go through these questions again. So, how is the balance? So, the car felt nice, but the entry, the car was understeering quite a lot. You know, the car seemed to tramline quite a bit. So, let's just write that down quickly. So, better, put to that. Front entry under braking. So that's the biggest thing that we really had, and we will put that in bold, and that's probably the only thing we need to fix. I think the setup was quick down the straights. It still wears the fronts a little bit more than the rears, which I think is not really fixable in the Lexus. But again, we can always help that by making sure the front is a little bit less divey, if that's even a word, under braking. So let's have a look and make some final tweaks and see how we go. Okay, let's go through this setup one last time. So you see powertrain, nothing needs changing here really. The car was rotating off throttle nicely and on throttle, so you don't need to change that. Maybe a couple of clicks here, a couple of clicks there, but we're nitpicking at that point. Brake bias doesn't need to change. You know, it's not the huge issue that we got. The only issue we've really got is the tramlining under braking. Packers, again, the car felt fine going into the corner, felt fine through the corner, wasn't bottoming anywhere at least. You know, I wasn't feeling any bottoming, so no need to change those packers. The front spring, you could argue we could raise back up, but I think it was, you know, a net gain despite the under braking issues that we're having. Dampers, I think that's where we're going to make the change. So I think we're going to go to 4 here on the slow bump. You could easily go up to 6, you know, or maybe even higher than that. You know, we're still relatively on the low end of the scale, but I don't think it's worth going hugely extreme initially. You want to make small changes and see, you know, where you're at. You know, if you go too extreme, you could easily make it worse and try and compensate with other issues. You're going down a rabbit hole at that point. So we're going to go down on the slow bump. And the rest of the stuff, I don't think we need to change. So let's go out and see how we get on. So, for the final time, let's see if we can finally get a setup that feels, you know, nearly there. You know, obviously we're not going to get the perfect setup. You know, it always takes a lot longer to refine than it does to actually get the setup in the window. And, you know, that's when a lot more advanced knowledge comes in. But what I'm kind of hoping to solve is obviously the entry tramlining, but also to make the front a little bit less floaty at high speeds. You know, front should feel a bit more direct ideally, while not feeling understeer. Feels a lot nicer through stow at least. What about into club? This was one of the big issue corners we had. Yeah, that felt a lot better to me. I broke a little bit too late, which means we got a better tramlining anyway, but it did feel nicer, that's for sure. The good thing is the car doesn't feel hugely different to what it did previously. It just feels slightly less aggressive on the front in terms of under braking. And it feels slightly more direct when you're actually turning in. I will move the brake bias slightly back as I feel we're a little bit too far forwards now. Not the greatest turn one from me there. I went in a little bit too deep. Not a great sector for me there, to be honest. Need to stop braking so late for that corner. You can see it was a lot nicer to drive through there, despite me outbraking myself by about a mile. Now that I've got it up to get used to what the car does, let's see if it actually feels better. Because I was still trying to drive it like it was on the previous iteration. Took a bit too much curb there. Go. Still not the greatest sector one, but it was better than the previous lap at least. But again, we know the setup will be better through sector 2. You can see a lot more steep ones are braking. Nicer through the mid corner. Yeah, that was pretty awfully driven by me, but you can see we still gained quite a lot of time. Again, pretty badly driven sector by me. But we're still up. This feels very close to what I actually want from the setup, to be honest. It's still not quite there, but I think we only need to go up one click really on the bump, on the slow front bump, and then we're pretty much there. Setup still feels a little bit vague. It still feels like it's not quite there. And off camera, I did actually try 6 front bump, and it felt like too much. So I think splitting down the middle is where we want to be. Let's see if we can finally get a, a relatively clean drop on that. So that can end the video there. Never mind. Never mind. It's okay. We've still got time in the lap, I think. So. Yeah, no. That's unfortunate. But again, we still did PB there. Or we still did get a quicker lap at least than we did before. So let's just go for an overview of what changes we made, how we're going to end the setup, and what other things to look out for when making a setup and making adjustments. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to change was just go bam, back up to 5. And I think we're relatively there. I think we can probably make the rear right height a bit higher, maybe go to 8.2, but we're splitting hairs at that point. I think what we've got now is a pretty decent setup. It handles relatively close to what I like. Obviously, there's more pace on it if you, decide to, I don't know, go less wing, for example. You can definitely go less wing. You can go a softer front spring. But I think with where we're at, we've kept the balance relatively similar. It's a little bit more pointy and definitely faster than what we had previously. So it's probably quite a good middle ground between a fully sports setup and what we had as the balanced baseline. So we'll just go through to summarize our changes. So preloads have gone down by quite a significant amount, or quite up, by quite a significant amount. Brake bias, we've gone forwards a little bit, but we can probably bring that backwards again. I think we were on 49.0 on that run just then. Suspension, we've softened it by a click and we've removed the front packer. The damper, we've stiffened the slow bump a little bit. And we've lowered the rear wing and inverted the front toe. So that's, again, not huge changes. Unless you were going to do a full rework, which obviously we've decided not to do here. You're not going to completely lose the balance, but we've just made small tweaks here and there each time, and I think that's got a pretty good result. Again, about half a second just from small changes here and there. So just to kind of show what I was going on about, actually, you can see here we started off the day on a 59.358. You can see we've done 29.069 sector 1, 34.58 sector 2, and a 55.69 sector 3. And I believe on pretty much the same setup, we also did a 0.0. We gained 0.2 in the first sector. I believe we did we did a few hundredths quicker in sector 2, and in sector 3 we pretty much matched it, did a few hundredths quicker as well. But by the end of the day, we were doing 28.7 sector 1, so again a 1/10.5 quicker. 34.4 sector 2, so that's over a 1/10 quicker. And then sector 3, 55.4, which is, nearly 3/10 quicker already. So again, that's just from a few stints. We're changing the setup, making small tweaks here and there. We haven't completely reworked the setup. We've just made small incremental changes. We've gained about 7/10 there from the very first run we did. And we've still got more time in it. I could already see there was a 0.5, 0.4 in there with this setup. So that just shows how little changes can make such a massive difference to your lap time and to your handling just by making small tweaks here and there. So now you should be a lot more confident on how the setup sliders work in the Mon Ultimate and how to adjust them to suit your setup preferences. However, we only worked on the qualifying setup there. If you want to figure out how to set up a race setup, check this video to the right of me now on screen. And I hope you enjoy that video as well. See you there. Take care and bye-bye.